Mr. Everton, and this is the first video in Unit 3, all about Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in Europe in 1500. Our new unit is about Europe in 1500. And our essential question is, when is challenging authority worth the costs? And spoiler, if you're challenging authority in Europe in 1500, that authority is probably the Catholic Church. Might be a king or a noble, but the person with the most authority was the leader of the Catholic Church. Let's talk, though, about what Europe was like in 1500. So way before this time period, like 500 BCE. So like 1,000 years before this. No, maybe 1,500 years before this. Europe experienced some real periods of success, some like high education, intellectual pursuits, science, math, art. And when I say that, I'm talking about ancient Greece. This is a painting of many different philosophers and mathematicians and doctors from ancient Greece. You can see Aristotle and Plato dead in the middle. Another period shortly after that was ancient Rome, which was also, this is a painting from much later, but this is some artist imagining what ancient Rome was like. And this was, a golden age, a time when Europe was incredibly successful. But that's not what's going on in Europe right now. Europe is at the end of something called the Middle Ages. So I made this chart. It's not in any way scientific. I don't have numbers to support this. It's just a way to visualize what happened. So European influence is like, how important is Europe? How much do people care about Europe? Okay. And then time is, time. So you've got a timeline on the bottom. The year 0 is when Jesus was born. 500 BCE is 500 years before Jesus was born. 500 CE is 500 years after. 1000 is, 500 years later. And then 1500 is when this class starts. Are you with me so far? I hope so. I hope that wasn't confusing. So how did European influence change over that time period? Well, it went like this. Started off kind of high, went a little higher, and then it went into a great big pit. The big pit is the Middle Ages, right? So after ancient Greece and ancient Rome are over, Europe goes into this like dark ages where, there's not any kind of science or knowledge or learning going on at all. People are very superstitious, and people are very focused on religion as a way of coping with the fact that their life is not that great. And then the Middle Ages ends with something that we're going to talk about in our next video, which is called the European Renaissance, which means rebirth. So the general narrative here is that ancient Greece and ancient Rome were the good times. The Middle Ages is a time period of like, bad stuff. And then the Renaissance brings Europe back up to, start to be where it was before. So Europe during this time period, it's about 1,000 years from the fall of Rome until the Renaissance, and they experienced something that we call decentralized government. Here you can see a king sitting on a throne, and you can see another man bowing to him. And the way that they ran government during this time period was called feudalism. It was basically like pledging your loyalty to someone else. So instead of like what we have today, which is centralized government, where we have, a government in Washington, D.C. that runs the country, and we have a government in Richmond that runs the state. This is decentralized government, where the king is actually pretty weak. The peasants, most people, like 90% 95, 99% of people who lived in the Middle Ages in Europe were peasants. They had a very poor quality of life. They worked really hard doing agriculture, farming. They didn't have any money. They weren't allowed to go anywhere, really. They had to stay on the land and work for the local lord who ran the land. And, they worked really hard. They didn't live that long. It was not, like if you got to pick any place in the world to live during this time period, you would not go to Europe. You would go to like the Islamic world, or you would go to China. That's where all the learning was happening during that time period. In Europe, things were kind of, they were crappy. I'm so edgy. I said the word crappy. Can't believe it. So the way that people coped with that was through Christianity. Christianity was the religion of Europe, and it was very important to medieval Europeans. Medieval just is an adjective that means of the Middle Ages. Here you can see the leader of the church crowning a king. That's the Pope crowning Charlemagne. The Pope is the leader of the Roman Catholic Church, and he has the power to name Charlemagne emperor. That shows you the power of the Catholic Church in Europe during this time period. Here's another picture of another Pope, Pope Gregory. The Pope is, according to Catholics, is infallible. The Pope is not capable of saying something that's not true. The Pope is the person who leads the Christian community, kind of like the Caliph is the person who leads the Islamic community. Okay, and they decide on church doctrine. Church doctrine is the rules for following Catholicism or Catholic Christianity during this time period. And you had to follow church doctrine or you weren't allowed to be a Christian anymore. Clergy is what we call, the people below the Pope, right? So like bishops and cardinals, and then going down all the way to the level of local priests. We call them parish priests. And the parish priest was the person who was in your village, who was the religious leader of your community, who led the church services, who did baptisms, like you see here. So when you're born, parish priest would baptize you. When you got married, the parish priest would marry you. And when you died, the parish priest would come to your house and say the last rites in hopes that you would go to heaven when you passed away. So like the parish priest was involved in like every aspect of your life. And then there were also monasteries. And a monastery is a place where clergy called monks would separate themselves, isolate themselves from society, and they would dedicate themselves to prayer and hard work, and a lot of times to working in scriptoria, like this monk here who is copying out a book. And all the books that people were able to read, which most people couldn't read, but the few people who could, if they had access to a book, it was a handwritten book, which is crazy to think about. Okay, so what are some of the beliefs of Catholicism? Well, if you are a Christian, then you probably already know about Jesus and the crucifixion. Jesus is the founder, Jesus of Nazareth is the founder of Christianity, and Christians believe that he is the Son of God. Not only that, but he is also God. So God and his Son and the Holy Spirit are the Trinity, and they make up God, basically. And Jesus was killed by the Romans by being executed. He was crucified. He was hung on a cross for 3 days, or I don't know how long it was, maybe 2 days until he died. And this is all an example of monotheism. Monotheism means you believe in one God, which is a neat trick, right? That they have these three things that are all God, but it's one thing. Anyway, monotheism, Jesus is the Son of God. And they believe in an afterlife. Look at this wild painting by Renaissance artist Hieronymus Bosch. This is somebody's imagination of what hell is like. Hell was very real, though, to these people. Like, even though this picture is bananas, it's called The Garden of Earthly Delights, if you want to see more. It's this amazing Renaissance painting of what this artist thinks the afterlife looked like. Anyway, they believed in hell, and they were very scared of hell. And so a lot of what people did was to avoid getting sent to hell when they died. And they believed that very few people were able to actually make it into heaven. And they had another version of the afterlife called purgatory for like people who weren't bad, but also not quite good enough to get into heaven. And it's a very complicated thing. They also believed in the New Testament, the New Testament being the second half of the Bible, which tells about the life of Jesus and his teachings, and then also has, the stories of some of his followers called the apostles. So the New Testament, they believed in a variety of other holy people called saints. So like the Virgin Mary. I'm not a Catholic, so I don't know the names of a lot of saints, but they had this whole group of saints that you could pray to. And, like Saint Bridget. I know there's a Saint Bridget. There's a Saint Patrick because of St. Patrick's Day. Anyway, I'm embarrassed that I don't know the names of more saints, but if you're Catholic, it's a very big deal. And also, it was vitally important that the Bible be written in Latin. Latin was the language of ancient Rome, and it was the language of the Roman Catholic Church all through the Middle Ages. Most people did not speak Latin. Only Catholic clergy spoke Latin. And so the Bible was written in Latin, and all church services were held in Latin, which means if you were a regular person, you would go to church, but you wouldn't understand what they were saying because they would be speaking in Latin. Okay, so that's a lot of information about the Catholic Church for you. I hope now that you can use some of those facts to summarize what was the role of the Catholic Church in Europe in 1500. Thanks for watching. I mean, you kind of have to if you want to get a good grade, but still, you did it. And I salute you. Wow, that was corny.